I've played tons of NES games, and I've noticed that not all games are created equal when it comes to the idea of how long it takes for us to complete them. Some games are incredibly long, and others can be beat in one sitting. Now, I did do a previous shortest episode, but it was dominated by arcade games, ones that looped, and many people didn't like that. One of the most important things you can do as a video producer is to incorporate the feedback from the community that built you, and that feedback led to a variation of this same episode omitting certain things. So in this particular episode, there will be no arcade games, only the shortest ones you'll find on the NES according to my own personal experience. Let's begin. Let's come in with a game that you might have heard of, Archon the Light and Dark, created by Freefall Associates, of which is their only game that mattered. Now, this might look like chess, but it's not, if that makes sense. The way it works is sort of complicated. It has a 9x9 board, and there are 5 power points, one in the middle, right, left, up, and down, and 18 different pieces, all of which have their own statistics. So if you take the time to play this, think of chess meets a slightly better battle chess. We can move pieces, and if we occupy a piece that is already occupied, those 2 pieces enter an arena and duke it out. In battle chess, we see a sequence, right? It's a pre-scripted one. The attacking piece is always going to win, the defending piece loses. But in this game, it's a little bit different. We have open combat. For example, if you move a Jin against a warrior, you'll have an advantage of shooting fireballs at the warrior, while he can only slash you with a sword. It's really unique, and honestly, I low-key want to check this out. You can win by taking out all of the opposing members' pieces, or by occupying all of the 5 power points at the same time. Ultimately, it's a 41-minute game, so I felt it was a good baseline for what we're doing in this episode. I've been meaning to do an episode talking about NES games based on game shows, but it is an Every Games Ever product, so it's going to be a little while before I can find the time to do it. Those episodes are very labor intensive, but I do enjoy the challenge. That being said, any game created by game tech inspired by game shows in principle is rather short, because they're just a gimmick, right? I'm impartial to Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, but both of those are tough to me because you have to have knowledge of the era. For example, I love doing crossword puzzles with Amanda, but the crosswords that we buy, many of them have clues that only 80-year-olds on oxygen would know. It's kind of the same for these games, but they are great, so give them a shake if you get a chance. They aren't long at all. Oh man, okay, so back in the day, there existed this non-stop battle for companies to obtain the licenses for certain things, and by proxy, they shit out video games. It didn't matter what it was. It could be TV shows, it could be a PSA, it could be anything that a potential customer of a fan base would see and say, "Oh man, I want that!" And that was none the more obvious than LJN's line of WWF games. Now, the good thing is, this is one of the later era releases on the NES, so in comparison to where LJN started on the NES, this is one of the better ones. It's still dog shit, but it's better. We can choose from 11 wrestlers, be it Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Bret Hart, The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, you know, the good talent from the era, and it's a solid roster. And while none of their special moves are included in this, because let's be honest, it wouldn't have been possible with just 2 buttons anyway, it's still a simple game from a simpler time, and if you can get past the seemingly non-existent gravity, maybe you'll become the champion and beat this game after 20 to 25 minutes. You know, I've played this a ton of times, and I've tried so hard to learn the controls for this game, and I feel that no matter what version I play, be it the Commodore 64, the DOS, ZX Spectrum, or the NES version, they are all ridiculously convoluted, or maybe I'm just bad at it. It's probably the latter. But the whole gimmick for this is that we go through various skateboarding events, 2 half pipes, 2 downhill events, pool jousting, and a few ramp-based games. There really isn't much to this at all. I feel it existed for folks who wanted to skateboard but didn't want to actually skateboard, which props to them. I played the hell out of Tony Hawk's Pro Skating as a kid, but never really wanted to get on a skateboard, so I guess I get it. I'm not going to judge anyone for having a game that they enjoy, but I will judge EA for being idiots. At most, it's a 20 to 25 minute game at best, and if you're me, you'll just score first on principle because you don't have anyone willing to play it with you. True story. Oh hey, Snoopy. Now, I wasn't big into Peanuts growing up, but I did know about Snoopy, and it was cool to check out this game when we covered the top 10 best alternative sports games. If you haven't checked out that episode, I'll link it down below in the description and at the end of this episode. Now, this game is interesting for a few different reasons. First, it's based on a PC game, known as Alternative World Games or Sports-a-roni. I actually learned about that while doing my conquest on NovoTrade. Kimco took the idea, adapted it to Snoopy for the American audiences, and holy shit, we have a game. But if you were a kid in Japan, you might recognize this game as having Donald Duck, and you would be right, and that stems from Kimco having the rights to Disney-based games at the time. Remember Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle? That's a rabbit hole and a half right there, but in Snoopy's Silly Sports Spectacular, we go through 6 different events, all of which are goofy, such as sack racing, boot throwing, pizza bouncing. You name it, it's there. It's just a silly distraction from the real world, and I'm all about that. This is a game that will always be on this list because it's not only stupid short, it's also stupid easy. Little bit of history. Where's Waldo is the American version of Where's Wally, created by Martin Hanford, and Where's Waldo as a NES game is based on the 1987 book, but it's significantly more crude than the other Waldo game, which will be on this list too. I think everybody knew that. In this game, our whole objective is to find Waldo, but the plot states we're trying to get him to the moon. Yeah, sure. We use a magnifying glass to scroll across the image trying to find Waldo, who changes colors in the more difficult versions. You know, that violates the rules of Where's Waldo, but why would Bethesda or THQ care? If you can find Waldo in 16 minutes, you go on to the next level, of which there are 8, and no, it's not going to be fun, it's going to be quite a rudimentary time. This game infuriated me because I spent so much time going through and playing it over and over and over again expecting a different outcome, but no, this game is just a one-trick pony of 3 segments, but we'll get there in a second. Rescue the Embassy mission might be familiar to those who enjoyed the retro computing era, such as the Commodore 64 or DOS, or maybe even the Amiga, or if we go farther back, the Acorn, because this game was known as Hostages. It was created by Infogrames and adapted to the NES as Rescue the Embassy Mission, where we sneak into an embassy, shoot out the windows that have enemies, rappel into the building, and then take out the bad guys in the embassy, and then recover the hostages. Then it's over! The whole process depends on how efficient you are, and at most it takes like 13 minutes. Did you know there was a pseudo-sequel to this game? It's known as Alcatraz, and it's just as stupid! But hey, at least you get 6 levels. Wow! What a time to be alive. You remember Skate or Die? This is the 3rd game in that franchise and also the final one to be released on a home video game console. The rest of them were isolated to the Game Boy. This game is a lot like the first one, except it isn't as bad. There are 6 events, and some of them are pretty neat. Specifically, the Snowball Blast. That's probably the one that I spent the most time on. There's something cathartic about lobbing snowballs at people, and it brings me back to one of my favorite games on Albino Black Sheep as a kid, Snowcraft. If you remember that game, you're a real MVP. But other than that, we just do a few snow-based sports mini-games like the half-pipe, and as a single-player game, this is kind of a joke, much like Skate or Die, but if you did have someone who is willing to play this with you, you can do a multiplayer hot seat up to 4 players. One of the mini-games supports 2 players simultaneously, but with that, the other mini-games were just, score-based. I was never a big fan of Ski or Die, but if I was forced, at gunpoint mind you, this is one that I would play. You remember how I mentioned that the 80s was a time where literally anything and everything that could be made into a video game was? Well, corporate mascots were no exception. Domino's had one with Yonoid, Purina's mascot Chucky was in an Atari 2600 game, even Weetabix had a game with Weetabix versus the Titchies. But the one mascot that always makes me giggle involves Spot, the one-shot mascot of 7-Up in the 90s, an anthropomorphic red circle that was involved in 5 different games. But this one is Spot the Game, which was the first, and honestly it's just a weird variance on Othello or Reversey, if you're familiar with that. Now, how we got a licensed 7-Up mascot game is kind of interesting. The board game was created by Dave Krummick and Craig Galley for Wise Owl Studios, but they didn't know what they wanted to do with it, so they sold it to Virgin Mastertronic. But they also didn't know what to do with it, so their answer to making money with this IP was selling a license to the Leland Corporation, who released the arcade game Attacks in 1990. At least the folks at Virgin knew a game could be made with it, so what did they do? They let Trilobite put it in their horrible puzzle game, The Seventh Guest. And it's there, trust me, the microscope puzzle, which is known collectively as Infection. It's a fucking horrible puzzle, and while we're at it, let's let 7-Up get a little piece of the action, and thus Spot the video game was born. That's all you need to know. The game itself goes by in, 8 minutes tops. It's kind of stupid. We already covered Where's Waldo. It was a short game, but the Great Waldo Search is even shorter. Why? Because it's stupid easy. In the original NES game, the sprite work was dreadful. Trying to find Waldo was a chore because the artwork just wasn't up to par. But in the Great Waldo Search, Radiance managed to make the sprite work actually look fairly decent, which is shocking because Radiance did fuck all for the video game industry. The game itself is based on the third Where's Wally book, known as The Fantastic Journey, but in the US, it was known as The Great Waldo Search. However, recent versions of this book have all been retconned back to the original name. There's really nothing to say about this one that I haven't said before. Find Waldo, find Wolf the dog, find scrolls. It only has 5 levels, the last being the most convoluted because it's the land of the Waldos. Again, it's a single player kind of game, and I'm sure Waldo never moves to another area, so once you beat it, that's it. You've conquered it. One trick pony. Well, unfortunately for us, this game is still at number 1, and I'm sure many of you will say, this isn't a game. Well, yeah, it is. Unfortunately. Does it have anything redeemable about it? No. No, it does not. But I kind of skimped over this game before in the previous episode, so I guess I'll talk a little bit more about it this time. It was created by Rare, and it has a tarot card reading simulation aspect to it. This wasn't unheard of. It was just stupid, right? House of Tarot existed in Japan for the Game Gear. Tarot Mystery was on the Super Famicom. So we have a very specific topic for a very specific group of people who find interest in tarot cards. At least Rare had the decency to say, hey dipshit, this is for entertainment purposes only. Probably a good idea for Rare to cover their ass when someone commits a heinous crime and tries to blame Taboo, the Sixth Sense, for it. Anyway, pop in the game, get a tarot card reading, get your lucky numbers, maybe see some 8-bit boobies, laugh at how Rare skated by Nintendo's religious restrictions and how Rare didn't care, yank out the game, play a real game, and yeah, that's Taboo, the Sixth Sense. And that's it for today's episode. What did you think of this list? Are there any games that you found to be exceptionally short? Feel free to tell us down below in the comments section. Who knows, maybe you'll expose someone in the community to a fantastic experience. Speaking of our community, if you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home in our community. We're gathering of phenomenal video game enthusiasts that love remembering a time when life was just a little bit easier to live. And if you align with that, feel free to subscribe. Finally, the single most important thing you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly affects the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.